Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Almost a year after an avian flu outbreak on an ostrich farm in rural British Columbia sparked international attention, the fate of the flock is in limbo. Canadian authorities say the remaining 400 birds must be killed, citing the risks to human and animal health. But the birds' owners and their supporters, including senior White House officials, see the Cull order as unjust government overreach, fueling echoes of debate over public health policy during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Caryn Ceolin, and today on The Big Story, I'm joined by virologist Dr. Angie Rasmussen to discuss how the case became a flashpoint and why the underlying issue at play has nothing to do with the ostriches. Dr. Rasmussen, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
So this all began last December amid an outbreak of the H5N1 bird flu. Can you just give us a really quick overview of the case itself and what ultimately led to the Canada Food Inspection Agency ordering a cull of the herd?
Yeah, so a very brief sort of history of this is that at some point in early December, a flock of wild ducks visited this ostrich farm. And shortly after that, ostriches started to get sick and die at the farm. It seems as though the owners did not actually report these deaths to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency or the CFIA, but an anonymous tip came in towards the end of December that got CFIA inspectors out to the farm. They took a couple samples from some dead birds and sent them back to the National Reference Lab in Winnipeg. They came back confirmed with H5N1. And at that point, CFIA issued a depopulation order or culling order, which is the standard practice for what CFIA does when a poultry flock is infected with H5N1. And that's kind of what has been the subject of this long legal battle ever since then.
I guess, can you just also briefly explain the science behind the CFIA's cull order? Like the farm supporters, they argue that the surviving birds are no longer a threat. Can you just explain why culling exposed flocks is the only way really to guarantee the risk to food systems has been reduced?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a really important point because it's not just a scientific issue. So the World Organization for Animal Health, or WOA, which is essentially the WHO for animals, has a policy essentially that many of the member states sign up for, and that's called the Stamping Out Policy for Avian Flu Management. And basically, what this is it's based on the idea that unless you cull the entire flock when you do have an outbreak of H5, because it is so contagious in birds and in many species of birds, especially chickens and turkeys, it's highly, highly pathogenic. So it will actually kill an entire flock of chickens and there will be no survivors. The most humane way to prevent that from happening and the best way to keep it from spreading to people or to other animals or to other farms and flocks is to just cull the entire flock. And this has been practiced now for decades. This is really the international standard for managing avian flu outbreaks in unvaccinated poultry populations. And we can certainly talk about the vaccination component to this later on, if that's something that you want to talk about. But in Canada, we don't vaccinate poultry. So Canada has agreed to abide by this stamping out policy, as many of the other member organizations of WOA have done. And one of the reasons why this is really important is because for decades now, it has been shown to be the most effective way to prevent the virus from spreading to other flocks and other animals and people. But also, it's an integral part of many of the trade agreements that people sign. So the reason that WOA has this provision is to facilitate international trade. And Canada, in all of its trade agreements, has agreed to carry out this management policy for avian flu. And that gives our trading partners confidence that when they buy poultry products from Canada, they're not going to be contaminated with H5N1 and possibly cause an outbreak in their country or make their people sick. So there is a scientific reason for this, in that it's known that this is the most effective way to control avian flu outbreaks and spread. But also, it's really, really important for the Canadian economy because our poultry export business is worth $2 billion a year.
So more than anything, there are economic implications here because, as you've just laid out, this is a condition for trade, and basically not calling these ostriches would jeopardize possibly our entire poultry export market. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, that's correct. So in making those trade agreements, we've essentially said that we're going to do this to give our trading partners the assurance that we will not be sending them Canadian poultry that's contaminated with bird flu, essentially. So if we don't cull these ostriches, then we will be in violation of those trade agreements. And our trading partners would have the right under those trade agreements to basically say no more Canadian poultry. We're not going to buy any, and there's an import ban on it now.
And you mentioned that we don't vaccinate poultry, but would there be any treatment for infected birds?
So there's not really. I mean, there are antivirals that are used to treat influenza. It is highly inadvisable to use them for poultry, and they're not used in this way. That is another reason why we've agreed to the stamping out policy. There's really two classes of anti-influenza antivirals. And they're really reserved for human infections, for sometimes in other species as well. But they're not used for poultry because generally they have to be given very, very early on, and resistance can arise very, very easily. And there is actually a precedent for this. There was an antiviral drug called amantadine that started to be used prophylactically in poultry in China. And almost immediately, all flu became amantadine resistant. And so that antiviral is essentially useless. So we don't use oseltamivir, Tamiflu, or any of the other anti-influenza drugs that we have just because we don't want resistance mutations to emerge. And it's really unclear that they would actually make a meaningful difference in terms of treating and eliminating H5N1 from these infected flocks.
So on the very surface, then, this case is, about biosecurity is essentially what it hinges on.
Yes, it's about biosecurity. It's also, I think, about economic security. I mean, I think that the trade agreements that Canada has made, are pretty substantial. Canada does have a significant poultry export market. And it really, to me, would be just as much of a crisis for Canada if we had a complete ban on poultry exports, just as much as it would be if we had more widespread H5N1 outbreaks. And right now, if you go to CFIA's website and look at the active outbreaks, there are actually quite a few H5N1 outbreaks that are all being managed in this way. There's, I believe, 12 current active outbreaks, including the outbreak on the ostrich farm, that are being managed by CFIA. And in order to prevent that 12 outbreaks from becoming, 22, 32, 52, 102, we really do need to implement the stamping out policy to make sure that our birds are protected and our food supply is protected, because the domestic poultry market would also be potentially really affected by this economically, and that is worth about $7 billion.
And yet, despite all of this that you've just laid out, over the last few months, the farm has amassed hundreds of supporters as part of this sort of all-out effort to save the flock. How does, an issue of disease management in a farm environment essentially become such a flashpoint?
Well, I think some of it was very much intentional, because as soon as the depopulation order was issued to the farm, Katie Pisitny, who has been acting as a spokesperson for the farm, she's one of the farm owner's daughters, essentially started contacting a lot of different politically conservative right-wing media in Canada and began talking about this and really framing it as an issue of government overreach and challenging CFIA's authority to even issue this depopulation order. Now, CFIA does have that legal authority, and I'll give the disclaimer that I'm not a legal scholar. I'm a virologist. But it's pretty clear in the Canadian Health of Animals Act that CFIA is authorized to carry out avian flu management plans and policies, and that this is in fact part of their mandate, which their mandate is to essentially protect Canadian health, Canadian agriculture, but also Canadian trade. So it really comes back to, is CFIA authorized to do this? Legally, yes, they are. The farm does not see it that way and has really been, I think, actively promoting the idea through this media network that this is an example of government overreach and that, CFIA should be either stripped of their powers, disbanded, but essentially they should be allowed to do as they like with their ostriches.
Do you trace this, anti-government sentiment to the coronavirus pandemic and to the anti-vaccine movement largely?
Well, actually, I very much do. So from my perspective, I'm American. I moved to Canada in 2021, and I've seen a lot of parallels to what happened in the U.S. As a result of a backlash, essentially, to pandemic public health policies. We had January 6, 2021, when a large mob of people who were supporters of President Trump attempted to stop the peaceful democratic transfer of power to President Joe Biden. And one of their stated motivations for that was, so-called medical freedom. To me, that was really paralleled in 2022 when the trucker convoy occupied Ottawa for several weeks, and their stated goals were essentially the same as many of the January 6ers, and that was that they felt the government should not be in the business of telling them what to do for the sake of public health. They had the individual freedom to refuse vaccines, to refuse public health measures, regardless of the toll that it would take on Canada, essentially, in Canadian health. And I see that much of the same motivation is driving the same people who are commenting on the ostrich farm and who are very vocally supporting it.
Well, you mentioned you're American, and Americans, too, are weighing in on this issue. Trump administration officials like RFK Jr., Dr. Oz, they've both pushed for the birds to be saved. Billionaire John Katzimatis, whom Trump has called a longtime friend, he says he's helping fund the legal battle by the farm. Why do you think, they're seizing on this and I suppose trying to spread their influence across the border into Canada?
Well, Caryn, I think it gets right back to the question that you just asked me before this. Why is there so much overlap with the anti-vax movement? I think that's exactly why Secretary Kennedy, Dr. Oz, and John Katzimatis, and all the U.S. officials who've been involved in this have gotten involved. I think that Secretary Kennedy is undisputably, his actions show, his words show that he is opposed to vaccination. He is definitely a medical freedom advocate, and that is becoming, unfortunately, U.S. policy. And I say unfortunately because it's actually going to cause the deaths of many, many people since he's systematically trying to strip vaccine access away from people. The main mechanism by which he's been doing this is largely a disinformation campaign in which he is saying things that simply aren't true. And that's not an exception with these ostriches. Secretary Kennedy, Dr. Oz have both stated, including in a letter to the president of CFIA, that these ostriches are a valuable scientific resource, that they can be used to essentially study vaccines and cures for H5N1. And none of this is actually scientifically true. Those ostriches are not valuable scientific resources. I don't think we can actually learn very much at all about H5N1 from studying them. It would actually be illegal to export them to the U.S. because the U.S. is party to the same trade agreements that we are, including the CUSMA trade agreement between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. And it would be against Canadian and U.S. law to certainly import live birds that are infected or were infected with H5N1 to the U.S. So none of this could actually even happen. None of the stuff that they've said about the birds is actually scientifically true, but they are nonetheless saying it. And that is really, really how, in my observation, Secretary Kennedy has managed to convince a lot of people that, maybe vaccines aren't so good. Maybe they don't work so well. Maybe they aren't the best way to prevent measles. And we see the consequences of this as well. In the U.S., we had a historic measles outbreak. There are currently new measles outbreaks that have started in the state of South Carolina and are spreading throughout the southern U.S. We will probably lose measles elimination status within several months if those outbreaks are not controlled. And it really all is part of the same disinformation ecosystem that is meant to push forward these pseudoscientific policies and really change the nature of reality.
Is that then what you think, Trump health administration officials gain from attempting to exert influence on Canadian policy? They're trying to, I suppose, legitimize their anti-vaccine policies and sentiment south of the border?
I think that one of the main issues is that it is helpful, certainly, to make the case to the American people that there is a broader consensus about the public health policies that Secretary Kennedy and the Trump administration are pushing forward, including the MAGA, or Make America Healthy Again agenda. And I think that having the support of a critical mass of people in Canada certainly helps that, or at least the appearance of a critical mass in Canada, because I do think that this is actually still a minority group of extremists who are supporting the ostrich farm. I don't think that actually many Canadians probably really care that much. And I think certainly most Canadians would probably opt for the solution to this that protects Canadian farmers, protects Canadian health, and protects the Canadian food supply.
I wonder if you think this at all erodes trust in public health agencies, given, as you've just said, that this is a fairly small group of supporters, but also given that there is, this sense in some of the rhetoric that the government is the bad guy. Do you think this is affecting public confidence in public health agencies among, the wider, average, everyday person?
So I think time will tell. I mean, I do think that actually, people in Canada are paying attention to this story because it's kind of wild, but I'm not sure that everybody really recognizes this element to it. It is one of the things that really concerns me the most about this, because we have this same problem in the U.S., and that is this idea that public trust in the government has been lost largely because of missteps that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. I actually don't believe that is the main reason why trust has been lost. I think that trust has been lost because there has been so much disinformation, and essentially there have been people like Secretary Kennedy and now like many of the ostrich farm supporters who are lying about what the evidence says, and they are misrepresenting the facts of the situation. I think if most people understood in Canada that the reason why the ostrich cull has to be carried forward is because it's the law, because it protects a major industry for Canada, and it protects our economy, which we need now more than ever, given the current trade war with the U.S. And it's also scientifically justified. I think that actually most people are supportive of that, because most people, and in Canada, this is certainly true, most people are reasonable. But if they are hearing information that is not valid, that is not in touch with reality, they're going to believe something different. And right now, that narrative is the same as it was in the U.S., and the same that it still is in the U.S., and that is that the government can't be trusted, public health can't be trusted. It's all part of this sinister plan to control people, take away your freedoms, when in reality, the purpose of these laws and regulations and policies is to protect Canadians.
So right now, the Supreme Court is set to either allow the call or stop it. We're still awaiting that decision. What's at risk here?
So, I mean, I think the main thing that is at risk, at least in the very short term, is the risk presented to the Canadian poultry trade. Both the domestic poultry market and the international poultry market. I think that, there's always the risk of H5. And as I mentioned, right now, it's bird migration season. It's starting to be flu season for humans. And this actually creates a very dangerous situation if there are human infections from the birds, because flu can do this thing called reassortment, where it can mix up its genes with another flu virus. So if you end up with a person who gets infected with H5N1, such as the people who are literally camping out and squatting on this ostrich farm, and they also have seasonal flu, you could end up getting a virus coming out of that would have enhanced transmission capabilities in people. We don't know if that's going to happen. We don't know what it would take exactly, but we do know that that's a huge risk. So that is also potentially at stake. It might be a small risk. We don't know if those ostriches ever were infected, so we don't actually know if they might still be infected now. We don't know if they could get infected again, but it certainly might be a small risk, but it would be a catastrophic risk. But I think, to me, the thing that long-term I'm really the most concerned about is the undermining of the rule of law and of public health officials. Like I said, I saw this happen in the U.S. It has led to the situation that the U.S. is in right now. And I don't even know how to talk about this without sounding incredibly hyperbolic, but it's really true. The more vaccines that are taken away, that are, blocked from Americans having access to them, the more people are going to get sick, and the more people, and especially children, are going to die. And so the stakes for this, for me, are, people's lives, essentially. By undermining public health, by undermining the government, by undermining the rule of law, you are undermining these democratic norms that we have relied upon for more than a century here in Canada, that, really are designed to protect all Canadians, not just a minority who wants to keep these ostriches around for the sake of their businesses, which in my opinion are also not very scientifically valid, and they haven't been completely honest about. So to me, placing the interests of a few people who also have extreme political beliefs or ideologies is really a huge threat, because ultimately it can undermine and even threaten democracy. And that's exactly what's happening in the U.S. right now.
So you see, the segments of the population who view public health orders as government overreach as the underlying issue here. How do we counter that?
Well, I think one thing that would help a lot is to have better communication and more transparency between the public and the government, better explanations about why this is happening. Now, CFIA has been pretty good about updating Canadians on the situation. They have regular updates on their website, but we're not actually allowed to really hear from CFIA officials themselves, other than in court documents and in statements that the agency puts forward. It would be really great, I think, for people to be able to hear from them directly and to have a bit better of an understanding of where they're coming from. The other thing is that it is really difficult to compete with this media ecosystem that has sort of centered around the farm. I mean, Rebel News had a helicopter out at the farm, and they are constantly broadcasting on social media every day from the farm. They are actively recruiting people to follow the farm and follow the farm's cause, and take up their own social media campaigns for the farm. And I think it's very difficult for the government to try to break through with that, because I don't think the government should actually be in the business of going on every single right-wing podcast, who demands that they go on and explain themselves. I think that one of the things going forward that's going to be really, really important is having people, not just me and my few colleagues who have been working in this space, but having a lot of people who have expertise in this, and not just scientists, but farmers as well, people who are stakeholders in this, agricultural specialists, things like that, talking to people about what these issues actually are, and educating them on, it's not just that CFIA wants to come in and kill these birds because they're mean and they want to flex their government muscle. They are actually doing it to make sure that we're protecting the entire Canadian trade poultry export business.
Do you think that that at all affects the government's ability to make and enforce laws and policy where public health is concerned? Maybe not now, but down the road?
I certainly think it might make it difficult for them to enforce policies, because what happens when the next farmer says, well, I don't want to cull my birds either? And, like I said, there are 12 current active outbreaks. Now, most poultry farmers do not farm ostriches. They are farming chickens and turkeys in Canada for the most part. Chickens and turkeys, as I mentioned, have really, really, really bad disease from H5N1. The reason why it's called highly pathogenic avian influenza is specifically because of what it does in chickens. And it is a horrific disease that will basically wipe out an entire flock. And we've seen this in the U.S. now with these very large flocks of millions of birds, where it will kill every bird within 72 hours. And it kills them pretty horribly. Flu is a gastrointestinal disease in birds as well as a respiratory one. It's also neurological. So the birds will be having seizures. There will be bloody diarrhea and vomit everywhere. They have this thing called torticollis where essentially their neck twists back. And it's really a horrible way for these birds to die. So most poultry farmers, if they are producing chickens and turkeys, are very, I wouldn't say that they're happy to participate in a cull, but they understand the importance of depopulating their flocks. And there is compensation available for farmers who have to depopulate their flocks. But what happens when somebody decides that they don't want to? In a chicken or a turkey flock, when you have an outbreak like that, it also presents a huge risk to the people who are going to be dealing with it. So the people who would be cleaning it up, it's incredibly inhumane for the birds. What do we do when chicken farmers say we're just going to see what happens? I think then that is going to cause real problems. Like I said, I think that many poultry producers understand the importance of depopulation, so I'm hopeful that that won't happen. But if it does, I think it's going to be increasingly difficult to continue to enforce and implement these evidence-based public health policies. And again, unfortunately, that's exactly what we've seen happen in the U.S. I'm actually very worried that these types of policies might start being implemented in the U.S. The Secretary of Agriculture last February developed a new avian flu management plan that did call for increased biosecurity to reduce the incidence of culling. Now, as far as I know, there has not been an outbreak in the U.S., and there are many outbreaks. Currently, there are 42 confirmed flocks infected, affecting over 6.3 million birds between commercial and backyard flocks. And I haven't heard of any of these flocks not being culled, but it certainly is a possibility that that could be implemented. That would have profound consequences actually for both the U.S. and Canada, because the U.S. is the number one importer of Canadian poultry. The U.S. also itself has a substantial poultry export market. So it would potentially cause huge economic disruption throughout North America, as well as the continued erosion of both Canadian and American democracy.
Dr. Rasmussen, appreciate your insight today. Thanks so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure, Caryn. Thanks for having me.
That was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can alternatively leave us a voicemail at 416-935-5935. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, follow, and share. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Thanks so much for listening. I'm Caryn Ceolin.